Welcome, Left Reckoning patrons, to the first reading series of 2025. Welcome to all those who will be getting this new one for the first time after joining us on the sort of compilation over the Christmas days, or the holiday days. But yeah, we have a good one here. Declaration of Principles of the Social Democratic Party, adopted at Chicago, June 11th, 1898, David.
Yeah, no, I mean, and thanks everybody for coming back and listening to us today. I think this is a really cool document. I will put a link in there for people to read it. It won't take you very long. Actually, unlike most of our other reading series, this is a pretty short one, but I think there's a lot of interesting insight here. And yeah, I mean, I have some introductory stuff to get into, unless you had anything else you want to say up at the top. Okay. Yeah, I mean, so one of the reasons I wanted to redo this text is because I think we are in a moment of where we really need to be thinking about building what our movement is about. And there's no better place to go, particularly in the American case, than back to the foundations of the Socialist Party, right? There's good and bad slogans, right? You think about things like Medicare for all. That's a principle that, one, fights for these kind of values that we fight for as socialists, but it's also something that's understandable to the average person. And it's something that is also highly mobilizing and motivating. And just contrasting that to something, which is still controversial to say, but it was true, like defund the police, right? Which didn't have that same kind of like aspirational politics behind it. I mean, actually, that's not fair. So there's a lot of aspiration there. But it didn't have the same kind of effect as something like Medicare for all did among the general population, right? And I think
the affirmative comes in later with defund, right? Like that you can get in and say, okay, so we're going to expand.
And it also came in way later in terms of like the public discourse too, right? There's defund the police, and yes, there's like the history of all those kind of ideas, but like I'm talking about for how somebody's experiencing this as like just your average day, everyday person in America, you hear this term defund the police. There's a bunch of arguments about that. And then maybe if you've tuned in long enough, you'll start to hear the and fund this and do that, right? So look, these are mistakes that have happened time again amongst the left. I'm just using kind of like more recent examples, which is why I think that this is a very interesting document to look at. Because I think when a lot of people are asked why they are socialists or what does it mean to being a socialist, people will give you all kinds of answers, right? And something like this platform here, I think is a pretty interesting starting point for talking about not just like the ideas and principles and morals that socialists may have, but actually effectively what they would like to do with power, which I think is something that's been missing from our sides. Without, that's probably enough preamble. I'll just like a very quick like historical note. As Matt noted, this is 1898. So you got to think about the moments in American history that we're coming out of, right? We've had these massive rail strikes, these huge railway wars. This is where Eugene Debs comes from, right? And these massive strikes happen all across the country, but they really hit a fever pitch in the Midwest and in the South. Out of this, a lot of people who might have believed in something, a concept called labor peace. Labor peace was the idea that capital, bosses, companies, and labor, the working class, might be able to come together and create, some kind of harmony, right? This is something that Eugene Debs believed for a really long time. And you still hear people talking about this idea. Eugene Debs sees why that's never going to work in his experience as an organizer during this period of time. And he commits himself to the radical political movement that we now know as American socialism. So there's a movement to start getting a lot of these forces together. There's a whole other bit too about the populists that we probably don't have enough time to get into. You could check out a lot of the stuff we've done on this program or my writings in Jacobin to really get a good sense of that. But the populists and people who came out of populism, particularly people who became disenchanted with populism as populism is beginning to sort of become absorbed into the Democratic Party. These are the kind of foundations of this Social Democratic Party, along with the American anarchist tradition, which is also represented in this moment. They all get together to create the Social Democratic Party, and we really want to focus on the principles here, but just very quickly for people who don't know, basically you have this large group of the left, let's call them, in America, getting together to form a new political organization, political movement. That's what this conference was about, and the Social Democratic Party does not last for very long. The Social Democratic Party only lasts for what, a year or something like that before it dissolves itself, and it dissolves itself over this kind of conflict over colonization. Basically, the anarchists and a certain section of the of the Social Democratic Party wanted to go out west and create little towns that would be run in a socialist way, and this divides the party because basically that faction wanted to utilize the resources, funding, and money to create these towns, while Eugene Debs and the union movement and the labor movement and the socialist movement all said, we don't want to have to recreate society. We have built America, right? Our laborers literally laid the tracks of the railroad that are about to bring modernization, right? We demand that. And this is a big divide between, at least in the American context, between a kind of anarchist approach to politics or to the economy, which is pulling yourself out of it, right? Oh, I don't want to participate in this anymore, versus the socialist position, which is we are going to seize the economy and utilize its massive productive forces for good. Anyways, this splits the party, but very soon after this, the Socialist Party of the U.S. is founded, basically from these principles. So this is very much like the kind of blueprint of what becomes the Socialist Party of America. And I've probably done enough history because I'm already tempted to start talking about what happens in the next 20 years. But I think this is probably enough to be able to look at this piece here.
It's funny that split about, how you react to how things are fundamentally being stolen from you that you produced as a class of workers. I remember Tim Pool and I forget what his name is, Moonlord guy.
Yeah.
And Tim's like, if you just don't like the king, go move to a different feudal sort of area. And no, you made that bridge that the king's horses are going over. Like, why you should have some ownership over that.
Totally, but also, sorry, we don't want to get bogged down on this, but you'll find out that kings had a pretty wide view of what belonged to them. Right, so the idea that you can just vote with your feet, I don't know, wasn't really going to work out.
Yeah, exactly. I'm gonna go find a better job in a different part of the Holy Roman Empire.
So I think, Matt, you're going to read us through this, but it's going to have, I think, it's 12 bits as the founding principles and its plans, at least in the first bit, and then the second bit is all in relationship to agriculture. But let's get into it.
Yeah, it is interesting, the special little farmer addendum. But yeah, here we go. We start. The Social Democratic Party of America declares that life, liberty, and happiness for every man, woman, and child are conditioned upon equal political and economic rights. That private ownership of the means of production and distribution of wealth has caused society to split into two distinct classes with conflicting interests: the small possessing class of capitalists or exploiters of the labor force of others, and the ever-increasing large dispossessed class of wage workers who are deprived of the socially due share of their product. That capitalism, the private ownership of the means of production, is responsible for the insecurity of subsistence, the poverty, misery, and degradation of the ever-growing majority of our people. That the same economic forces which have produced and now intensify the capitalist system will compel the adoption of socialism, the collective ownership of the means of production for the common good and welfare, or result in the destruction of civilization.
So I just, wanted to note one thing there, that already this is a kind of a radical text, because if you ever engaged with the American history of populism and the American history of socialism, there is a kind of argument that has been popularized for a while, that basically the socialists were kind of accidental inheritors of these kind of movements, that there wasn't a particularly strong socialist conception of the class struggle. And in fact, it was more about what Matt and I were talking about before we went live here, the Jacksonian perspective, which is very much about the kind of big owners versus the small owners, right? It's still a conflict of property, but it is not between the wage worker and the capitalist. It is between the small owners and the big owners. And this whole first section here is no small thing, is what I'm saying, is that this is very clearly delineating itself from the populist movement or the People's Party that came out of it, by making these kind of explicit arguments about the working class and not just the small owners versus the big interests. And you see these tensions still exist today. Think about the socialist movement as it exists in America. And then think about like the anti-monopoly movement as it exists in America, right? You could see how these people can be in the same room with each other, but also very clearly how they have fundamentally different beliefs about what needs to be done about society.
It's kind of remarkable that Steve Bannon is the inheritor of the Jacksonian thing, and he's in the FT saying we need to raise taxes on people because of Luigi. Like, fascinating. All right, we'll continue. That the trade union movement and independent political action are the chief emancipating factors of the working class, the one representing its economic, the other its political wing, and that both must cooperate to establish the capitalist system of production and distribution. Therefore, the Social Democratic Party of America declares its object to be the establishment of a system of cooperative production and distribution, through the restoration to the people of all the means of production and distribution to be administered by organized society in the interest of the whole people and the complete emancipation of society from the domination of capitalism. The wage workers and all those in sympathy with their historical mission to realize a higher civilization should sever connection with all capitalist and reform parties and unite with the Social Democratic Party of America. The control of political power by the Social Democratic Party will be tantamount to the abolition of capitalism and all-class rule. The solidarity of labor connecting us with millions of class-conscious fellow workers throughout the civilized world will lead to international socialism, the brotherhood of man. As steps in this direction, we make the following demands.
And maybe before we get into there, I just, again, I think it's kind of critical to sort of see the very, just like in the lessons it has for us today, is that these are people who went through the experience of populism, right? And the experience of the People's Party in, third party movements, effectively, that tried to merge the progressive forces, let's call them, of society, the frustrations of small landholders with wage workers, be they agricultural or industrial. And yet, as you're starting to see in this moment, a lot of these populist movements begin turning their backs, or at least according to these folks, on the populist ideal by entering into the Democratic Party, right? Which is, as people who, if you remember this from your high school history, the only time you hear about American populism is that some guy talked about a cross of gold, and then they basically became members of the Democratic Party, right? It's a little bit more interesting than that. And, the populist movement, I don't say this to like denigrate it. I'm fascinated by it. I find it to be a very important moment. But I think that one thing that I have been appreciating more and more as I read about the populist moment and then the latter socialist and union movement in America is that it wasn't so much that the populists became socialists as much as it was that the socialists and the trade unionists, at least in the South and the Midwest where those movements were strongest, came out of populism and became disenchanted and disappointed and frustrated with populism because populism was not able to sort of break out, frankly, of the class contradictions, that are clear to all of us today, right? That it had, this certain class of wealthier folks in it who might not want to sort of upend the entire system of capitalism, but maybe want to make sure that they're getting better prices at market.
Right.
But anyways, I just think so all of this stuff is particularly notable that they're sort of articulating here in that historic moment. But yeah, let's get to this platform.
Yeah, so here's the step number 1 of 12 of this first set here. Revision of our antiquated federal constitution in order to remove the obstacles to full and complete control of government by all the people, irrespective of sex. Which is an interesting inclusion. Bernie bros. I mean, I had deleted a tweet earlier about, Bernie was one of the senators voting against this Lake and Riley Act. And I just, had some more fire for people who wanted to accuse him of being a nativist a while ago. And like, they're like moot now. I think they took an early weekend. Yeah. But, these movements and again, like it's wherever in the country you look at them from the left side of things, often it's not even that they're fairly good on the question of gender inequality. It's that women make up a huge part of the actual people doing the footwork and discussion of these things. Mm-hmm. And really the failure of a lot of these things to grapple with, say, the patriarchy has more to do with the broad American culture and not the sort of that these movements secretly have the, some sort of patriarchal fundamental strain in them. It's just like society was that way, and all these different movements in fact led the struggle against that to liberate women, but ultimately, like maybe in the 50s and 60s, like I'm talking about specifically the Nonpartisan League in North Dakota, succumbed to a more traditionalist current in the broader American sort of society.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that like noting that these movements are genuinely like the tip of the spear. I mean, like without these demands, and these demands come in the populist movement as well. And these are some of the first things being outlined. This is number one on the platform here is, looking at the unequal citizenship in the United States of America, right? And this is something that like socialists, I think, should be a little bit stronger voiced on when, I mean, if I were to be able to go back in time, to those kind of Bernie bro slurs about saying like, no, absolutely not. You don't get to accuse these movements that have been at the forefront of these struggles for racial and gender and justice around sexuality of being primitive on these kind of ideas. The only difference is that the Hillary Clintons of the world, to use those kind of divisions, they want a anti-sexism movement that leaves capital and that kind of privilege untouched, right? And the ways that these kind of like the way that the Democratic Party, that the kind of ruling class ideology around these questions sort of articulates itself is not actually about emancipation for anybody. It's about a redistribution of the spoils for the people at the very, very top, which has always been the left's socialist critique of quote unquote identity politics. And it's very helpful to be able to look in history book and see that, this isn't just some kind of deep digging that people are doing like, oh, well, this obscure character in like Indiana was like a very good feminist in the socialist movement. But rather, no, It's like plank number one of the founding of the party is about this.
Cishet, yeah. The number two, the public ownership of all industries controlled by monopolies, trusts, and combines. Now, I like that. Relative to the trust busting approach that is more, or was followed more by, like, say, Teddy Roosevelt or whatever. There are certain things that are monopolies and they should be regulated and controlled by the government. I think of like that with telecommunications. A lot of the innovations that are being capitalized on by major companies like Apple, and that stuff is all publicly developed. And sure, maybe that there's maybe Ma Bell got a little bit sclerotic at times, but the solution wasn't to privatize and break it up. The solution was, it should be obvious now, given that all these companies, not even defending, like, say, net neutrality, like you could have applauded them for doing so 10 years ago. They're just vultures and parasites, and they're nickel and diming us.
And I think one thing you'll really notice about the writings from the socialists of this time is the way that they articulate these demands as well, right? In the language of, oftentimes of Christianity, but also of like the American Republic and the American democratic tradition. And in arguing that, like, insofar as things like do tend towards monopoly, right, do tend towards concentration, then we should let no man be a lord over the rest of society, right? If it is like the unyielding laws of, capital or economics that these things will tend to centralize, then we should make sure that a centralized power is controlled by the everyday people. And, again, like being able to speak it in that way, I think is very, very beneficial for getting these points across to everyday people.
Right, like nothing is clearer than risk pools, which is mathematically, this math, you want the largest risk pool, that's it. And so, like, when you hear we need competition or something like that, it's like, we don't need healthcare competition. We need everyone sharing the risk broadly. Yeah, there you go. Number 3, the public ownership of all railroads, telegraph, telephone, all means of transportation, communication, waterworks, gas and electric plants, and all other public utilities. Again, batting 1,000 so far. And that's even before you have climate change as a motivating factor. Number 4, the public ownership of all gold, silver, copper, lead, coal, iron, and all other mines. Also of all oil and gas wells.
I mean, so I have to say that just the thought of what would happen if, like, all of the oil
think of the American government that would have developed had that been instituted at that point. Like, it changes the axis of the world if that had happened then.
100%. And also, like, both on the side of what could be distributed, in terms of like public goods to people. but also just in like kinds of rationality. Like you think about like something like oil production in the States, right? In Texas and all across the country, these kind of abandoned wells that are causing massive issues because, oh wow, speculation and private competition creates a whole host of problems, particularly that no one wants to pay the fucking bill.
Right.
When things go wrong, right? So just imagining like a more rational way of engaging in production versus like the There Will Be Blood style bonanza.
And honestly, like fostering maybe one of the most evil industries in terms of just political influence and machinations over the next century after this. I mean,
just like bringing that to heel immediately.
Don't let it. That's what they call strangling in the crib, to put it bluntly.
Would you go back and get baby Hitler?
Exactly.
I would go back and get baby Exxon or whatever.
Exactly. Number 5, reduction of the hours of labor in proportion to the increasing facilities of production. You know, you look at wage and productivity decoupling for the last 40 years. You're like, yep.
I mean, I think this is a real fundamental demand that like must be made, particularly like, you know, as somebody who does media, you know, I know you engage with this as well, Matt, right? You see certain topics and you see that there's just a lot of attention and interest in them. And like AI is certainly one of those, right? And regardless of if it's like a bubble or not, why is there such an anxiety about AI? Because almost every conversation is about one thing. Am I going to have a job in 5 years, or is my job going to be taken away from me? Right?
Yep.
Because people's experience with new technology has been that labor-saving technology has been used to harm them instead of help them. And while Elon Musk and capitalists want to maintain their control over society and offer something like a UBI to people, a much more effective demand is to say, hey, if my job is now only a 30-hour-a-week job instead of a 40-hour-a-week job, I should be able to reap in that benefit instead of the asshole boss who's doing nothing. And just seeing that as a demand in 1898, you know, before again even more of the technologies that were going to come, shows that these are like universal laws and tensions within capitalism, rather than, you know, symptoms of the modern era, which you know, sometimes people fall into the trap.
And I think it's like, you know, the anti-work stuff that's sort of taken off. Like, I think tying it to the increasing facilities of production, basically packages this as a communal effort, and everyone is not only like benefiting from it, but like contributing to it. And so it's not something where it's like, oh, we just want the robots to, you know, make my toast in the morning. It's because like technology has advanced in such a way. It's no, we have been helping society develop to such an extent that it can build these sorts of machines and train these sorts of models. Number 6, the inauguration of a system of public works and improvements for the employment of a large number of the unemployed, the public credit to be utilized for that purpose. Damn, Obama. Like, we had low interest rates for so long, and then we started doing the infrastructure spending after that.
Yeah. And the infrastructure spending that's going to last, what, 6 months before they pulled the plug on all of it. I mean, Emma Vigeland shared a story about, you know, what's going on in Oklahoma, where there's now just like this big public freak out about like the windmills that have been developed, you know, in recent years, and it's set to like expand dramatically because of the IRA. And you just are like, God damn it, we spent so much money and it's going to, one, get pulled back, and two, it's because one of the things that people were complaining about was that they're not feeling the benefit of it. What they are experiencing is, you know, a lot of like production near them, and like their skyline is literally changing, but they're like, I'm not getting a job. I'm not getting an opportunity. Someone else is kind of pulling that money, you're just making money off of like the land. Yep. And you just see something like that, and you're just like, God damn it, what a wasted opportunity. Again, dealing with climate change, you know, is, you know, for just making people's lives better, not to mention obviously like the climate impact, but just like that engagement with providing meaning and work and opportunity to people. Yeah. And I think your point is great, Matt, that like at a moment of low interest rates, we fucking sat on our hands and said like, you know what? Yeah. Should we build, I mean, like here in Austin, like we have so many great New Deal projects that like make life better. Like, you know, Barton Springs is like an incredible, like a highlight of the city, right? It's a beautiful public pool, spring fed, just unbelievable. If you go to Austin, like you have to go. everybody loves it. It's such an important social spot for everybody. And it was just like back in the day, they were like, hey, we got some money. We should we should do something nice for the community. Could you imagine, if the era from 2008 to 2016 was just massive public works projects and beautifying America, all that kind of stuff?
Well, where are the public-private partnerships to do that stuff?
Yeah, no, let's give it to Elon Musk and to the Apple Corporation instead. And
Exactly.
see what they do with it.
7, all useful inventions to be free to all, the inventor to be remunerated by the public. That is American.
That's a Matt Leck
I
special.
am. It's funny, we like talk about all these like, free trade deals. We're trying to do these free trade deals. And pretty much a good chunk of that is, don't steal our intellectual property.
Yeah.
The free trade thing is, please don't take docs from us. And I personally think that maybe that wasn't the most long-sighted way of dealing with the emergence of an economy like China. I think maybe they will figure out how to do some of that stuff for themselves if you just like cut them down from having it. So maybe I don't know. China's a whole bigger thing, I guess, to get into than that. But yeah,
not to get like too starry-eyed about it too, but whatever, dude. We're talking about like socialism and the better world in the future. It's crazy to think about what you're saying here, Matt, is that like, what if we like restricted knowledge and capacity to engage with like human ingenuity? And that's effectively what, these patents are, right? Or denying people the opportunity to tinker, to expand, to grow the knowledge base, not just produce things, right? But to be like, okay, well, how does this machine work? Oh, could I make it better? Could I do this? Could I make it run more efficiently? Could I make it cheaper? Whatever, right? That's the kind of thing that you want on this planet. Right, because we want to live in a more technologically advanced, globe. Sorry, and instead of doing that, we're like, why don't we create these little fiefdoms and like limit human capacity? Which, in a way, you're sort of shooting yourself in the foot because you're just slowing down technological progress as well. Yeah. Right, and you only get one life to live, and you're basically like slowing down in what technologies are available by who knows what number.
Just artificially suppressing it because people want to get a return on whatever. Yeah. Let's see. 8, labor legislation to be made national instead of local and international where possible.
It's great.
Yeah.
I mean, for real. I mean, this is, even though this might freak out somebody like Matt Iglesias, who wrote after that factory fire in Southeast Asia, that is great that all these companies can, take advantage of workers in other parts of the world. One thing that's really notable about the socialist movement is like how pro-federalism, like the federal government they were over state and local government. You don't have to do too much digging to understand why. But you look at American society today. I mean, what do the states do with one another? We're just waging war against each other. I mean, Texas versus California right now. Texas is saying to big companies, hey, you can pay your workers less here. They'll have less protections, and we'll create a special court for you that you don't have to go to the public courts that everyone else goes to. I mean, it's a real negative. And I think it is fascinating. Again, the country's so young at this point, or relatively so, that they already, and the capitalism that we know today in 2025 really does prove that the anxieties that these people had about these kind of systems were 100% correct.
Right. National insurance of working people against accidents and lack of employment for old age. That is, it's interesting to see that before sort of medicine really takes off, right? So it's accident instead of health insurance. But of course, the national insurance part goes back to the point about natural monopolies, which is that these things that are so clearly like benefit from scaling effects and size, like insurance programs, they should just be, the national government is the perfect person to take care of that. 10, equal civil and political rights for women and the abolition of all laws discriminating against women. 11, the adoption of the initiative and referendum and the right of recall of representatives by voters. And then 12, abolition of war as far as the United States are concerned, and introduction of international arbitration instead. That is one of the more depressing things, and I hope that's not where the anti-nuclear movement is going, but there used to be a very big movement to completely abolish war. Like around this time, Mark Twain was a famous exponent of it, and you don't really hear. I think the Irish Prime Minister is getting a lot of heat for not wanting to raise defense contributions to NATO right now. Like people who want to take that approach, this is not a very hospitable world for them right now, which is a real shame.
Yeah, and obviously, famously, too, Eugene Debs goes to prison for his opposition to World War One. I'll just add that I think that number 11 is very. They're all important, obviously, but like 11, the notice about recalling representatives having referendums is a very interesting one, and you see that being like a very important tool for engaging in positive policy, particularly when the government is ineffective. It's a shame here in the state of Texas that we don't have those kind of statewide referendums. I wish we did. I'm sure we would be able to do something on abortion here. And again, recognizing that like putting power directly into the hands of the people is fundamental demand of these kind of movements. And look, I mean, we'll get to the farmer stuff in a second, but I'll just say, look, is this everything that being a socialist is? No, obviously not. Right? That's a pretty incredible worldview that just thinking about how excited we were getting talking about this back and forth. I mean, pitching something like that to somebody, being able to point somebody to a document like that is something that I think we are sorely lacking, because for the most part, when people talk about their politics, they're talking about vibes and sort of we're against this and we're against that. And certainly the socialists were against plenty of ours, but they were also very much for and had this other kind of vision here. And I think that's something that is completely lacking at this point in the socialist movement. And it oftentimes allows the socialist movement to only be defined by its opposite and what it opposes, but also to be more defined by American liberalism and American progressivism. And what I mean by that is socialists are going to be the ones who are going to be the most firebrand fighters for something like a $15 per hour minimum wage, something like that is so commonsensical that to oppose it is folly. To oppose something like the minimum wage, but that is not the horizon of socialist politics, particularly on labor. Nor is the $15 minimum wage, I think, even any longer the actual socialist demand. Right? It's already gone on long enough that it's probably eclipsed its time. But because socialists are the ones who are going to fight the hardest for that kind of things, it means that a lot of our movement becomes kind of defined by progressive liberalism or liberalism in general, right? Or any host of major struggles that we engage ourselves in. And I'm not saying engaging in those is wrong, obviously, but what I'm saying is that if that's the public face of our movement, then again, socialists just come off as very, very progressive progressives or very, very liberal liberals. And this is, I think, a really interesting counter narrative or a different path to take for defining our views.
Right, because it's not really an extreme issue; it's a practicality, and does this make any going back to the whole the gender and class thing, right? To me, the big mistake of as young Bernie bros back then is no, liberals don't have the gender and race stuff either. They don't have the goods on that. There's a implicit sort of premise that the left does the class stuff and the liberals do the other stuff. They don't do that either.
That's
all
true.
right. Here is demands for farmers. I'd be interested, who do you think? Well, I'm curious who you think replaces farmers if this was going to be written today now, because it had a lot of juice politically. This was a good call because farmers did a lot after this politically, but obviously not the same sort of, population now than they were then.
Yeah. I wouldn't know. It's an interesting question.
Demands for farmers. The Social Democratic Party of America does not hope for the establishment of social order through the increase of misery, but on the contrary expects its coming through the determined, united efforts of the workers of both city and country to gain and use the political power to that end. In view of this, we adopt the following platform for the purpose of uniting the workers in the country with those in the city. 1. No more public land to be sold, but to be utilized by the United States or the state directly for the public interest, or leased to farmers in small parcels of not over 640 acres, the state to restrict regulations as to improvement and cultivation, forests and waterways to be put under direct control of the nation. Nice there, and even a little bit of proto, before the Dust Bowl environmental nod there. 2. Construction of grain elevators, magazines, and cold storage buildings by the nation to be used by farmers at cost. North Dakota did a state grain elevator 20 years after this. 3, the postal railroad telegraph and telephone service to be so united that every post and railroad station shall be also a telegraph and telephone center. Telephone service for farmers as for residents of cities to be at cost. I mean, that's another thing. Post offices should have been the ISPs. We should have built on a lot of this sort of existing, or even fine, public schools put you're not going to get put towers for 5G over schools. Maybe maybe today, the well's poisoned on that, but yeah. 4, a uniform postal rate for the transportation of agriculture products on all railroads. 5, public credit to be at the disposal of counties and towns for the improvement of roads and soil for irrigation and drainage.
So, and some interesting ones, extremely practical. And I think that what's interesting and what is of note historically is basically what's coming down the way in the next few years in the division of the socialist movement around the questions of agriculture and labor. Because there are basically, let's call them 3 different poles. There's the New York City socialists, who I don't want to denigrate at all, because they were the engine of a lot of this, but they were very traditional Marxist socialists, and they sort of viewed rural America, particularly agricultural production, as a vestige of of a kind of pre-industrial society, and something that needed to be eradicated. That was obviously not very popular outside of New York City and Philadelphia, which then created these other 2 tensions, which were the Midwest socialists, and I'm using kind of more antiquated, early 1900s version of what we would call the Midwest. But those were interesting because they tended to really be that kind of almost Jeffersonian farmer, small landholder farmers, and there was a very strong socialist tradition in those communities. In fact, a lot of the early leaders of the socialist movement came out of that kind of Midwest area, right? Indiana, Pennsylvania, Western New York. And a lot of that was very much Christian socialism. And I'm getting to the point here. The third one arises in the vestiges of the old slave society, and that is the Southern agricultural system, which was the opposite in every way of the Midwestern agricultural system of small farmers. No, it was tenant farmers. The work had moved from slavery to wage work. And it was an interesting kind of tension with the Southern tenant farmers and these other socialists, because, the Midwesterners sort of wanted this old way of and sort of to almost leave the agricultural question out of the revolutionary question. While a lot of the Southerners were actually did support ideas of communal agriculture, but rather agriculture that was communally owned instead of owned by the plantation boss, who literally oftentimes was still the son of the slaveholders. And, so this becomes a real fundamental tension across the board. And it never gets resolved. I mean, it gets resolved via technology because the tenant farming system just dies out to machines. But this is an interesting thing. So the next 40 years of socialist organizing is really going to be dealing with this kind of question. I'm biased. I think that the H.L. Mitchells and the Southerners really showed probably the best way forward out of it. But this is an interesting note here, I just have to say, because you see that these ones are very kind of practical and agreeable reforms here. There is no talk about agricultural collectivization, right, which was, very much opposed by many, many people, even at this time.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. The one note where they said it's, uniting the workers in the country with those in the city. That workers is an interesting word and kind of broadly applied, it seems to me there.
Well, it's this is a real thing. Sorry, but it's there's always this question of who is and who isn't a worker, right? And, and this is a little bit more interesting debate than the stupid things we have online today about whether or not Starbucks workers or whatever. Those people aren't real socialists. Anyway, we're saying that kind of bullshit. But, the point is this has always sort of been a tension. And, the American system being such an agricultural nation for most of its history, I mean, this really was one of the fundamental contradictions of building a socialist movement in America. Ironically, as that tension starts to alleviate itself, the socialist movement starts to go on a bit of a decline. Right, in the U.S., right, as farming becomes less and less fundamental industry in the sense of how many people are employed in it, it doesn't actually lead to a strong socialist movement. But maybe that's a question for another day. Yeah, I mean, you got any thoughts about the text? It's an interesting one.
It is, and I always appreciate the rehashing and going over certain, like, the Communist Manifesto does this very well too, of like summarizing the discussion we've been having and packaging it in a succinct way. I think this does really well. And again, like, yeah, it's hard to feel completely lost when you look 100+ years ago, and a lot of the like solutions that you've sort of been arriving at for your time were pretty much the ones they arrived at then.
Yeah, no, it does make you feel a little good when you can hear a little bit of yourself in some of those arguments.
Yeah, except
they're making.
I'd be a big telegraph bro. Be like,
no, you got to invest. You have to invest in the. Yeah, I mean, fuck. Actually, like, I do wonder if I would be good at like playing if I was able to go get transported back, if I could make a bunch of money, or if I would forget everything.
Try to corner a market. Yeah,
you end up get the dates wrong. You know what I mean?
You end up building a railroad, and some guy just poisons you.
Oh, man. Well, folks, I hope that y'all appreciate this. And as always, I mean, I think we've done a lot of these in the past, but I think actually it's just because I've been doing a lot of it for my own research stuff, but like doing a little bit of more time on the American socialist tradition, I think is I think very fruitful, because it's a lot richer than I think people realize. I mean, here's what I'll say. For a long time, and this is like to my own shame, for a long time, I viewed the American socialist tradition and engaging with it as more of a way to study praxis, right? Sorry, and that's like jargony, but like not as a way to like engage with like quote unquote theory, but a way to look at practice, like what tactics work and which ones don't. And the longer and the more that I've engaged with it, I realize that that's just very wrong-headed. It's, again, not to be cliche, but it really is the synthesis of so many of the arguments that we have today. These were people who, despite all odds, were very, very educated, very, very engaged in serious questions. It wasn't just sort of people stumbling around like blindly, to these things. It's like, no, these were very purposeful and principled folks.
And the stakes were high.
The stakes were very, very high. Exactly. Well, friends, we appreciate y'all so much, and we'll be back on Tuesday.
Peace.